Okay, so Frantz Fanon. I know some people have come in here hoping to find out who he is. Okay, so Fanon was a Caribbean writer. He was also a poet. He was also a psychiatrist and interested in philosophy. And he really came into his own in the period of the 1940s and 50s, a period that was deeply infused with political ferment, particularly in terms of the former colonies of European empires. And it was in the process of, and the politics of decolonization that really began to shape what Fanon was about. That's better. Okay, you still hear me? In 1958, Fanon addressed an anti-colonial conference in Ghana. And he had this to say: "If Africa is to be free, we cannot beg. We must tear away by force what belongs to us. All forms of struggle must be adopted, not excluding violence." Fanon became a revolutionary in this period of the late 50s and early 60s. And I think it's quite fitting that over half a century after his death, we are seeing a resurgence of interest in his ideas. If you come to the front, you will see a series of books, both books that have been written by Fanon that I will refer to, but also two excellent books here detailing the biography and the politics of Fanon that have been published in the last few years. The ideas of Fanon in the late 50s and early 60s inspired the great Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, who went on to be the founders of the Black Panther Party. Also, in 2014, the Black Lives Matter movement shared a tweet which went viral, and it was widely circulated. The tweet was about that when people fight back, it is quite simply because they could not breathe, which is a quotation from Fanon's work. And the quotation that we cannot breathe are also the words that apparently were uttered by Eric Garner, who was a young boy, black boy, who had been strangled to death by the American police, who, of course, were then completely let off. And these were the last words that he said as he was choking to death, saying that he could not breathe. So I think this really demonstrates the vitality of Fanon's ideas for the 21st century. Now, Fanon was born in 1925 into a middle-class family in the island of Martinique, which then was a French colony and still is to this day. His mother was a shop owner and his father was a customs agent. Fanon himself was of a mixed heritage background. His father was also a product of a mixed heritage background, being a descendant of former African slaves and also of Indian indentured labourers. His mother was black Martinican, but also on her mother's side had Alsace ancestry within her. And that family upbringing itself and the product that Fanon was gives a glimpse of what Martinique society was like. Like most of the Caribbean societies at that time, these are societies that were very deeply structured by an incredible racial hierarchy where differences in skin coloration, your skin hue, basically dictated where you were going to be. So the lighter your skin color, of course, if you were white, you were at the very top. And if you were really, really, really black, you were at the very bottom. And in between, you had all sorts of other layers. And the lighter you were, the more your chances were in that society to rise up and therefore to aspire to be middle class. This is the kind of background that Fanon was born into. And of course, as a result of this, he was encouraged to identify himself as being French. So he spoke French. His parents wanted him to desist from speaking Creole because that was the language of the riffraff and the poor, etc. They aspired to assimilation in French society, and therefore it's not surprising that at the age of 18, Fanon leaves Martinique and comes over to Europe to join the French Free Army, the Gaullists, in the fight against fascism, because of course he completely identifies with the notions of the French Republic and notions of freedom, liberty and fraternity. But of course, when he arrives in Europe and in the war, it's a very, very different story, because whilst in his native Martinique, there were all these gradations of colour, and someone of his mixed ancestry and background could find a niche for himself beneath the whites, of course, who were the aristocracy, but certainly above everybody else who was darker skin colour than him. Of course, in Europe, he confronts naked, in-your-face, blatant racism at every single corner that he turns, because it didn't matter that he may have had Alsatian ancestry or anything like that. He was just seen as being, just another dirty brown-skinned, black-skinned man, and that this is the way that he was going to be treated. And so, for example, one of the things that absolutely shook him to his foundations and he became very bitter about was that there he was fighting against the fascist forces, and he suddenly discovered white women who were liberated by the free forces of the Free French Army preferred to dance with Italian fascist soldiers who had been their captors and their tormentors, rather than dance with black soldiers who were part of the French army. And this, of course, not only led to an incredible sense of resentment and bitterness, but also a questioning of what kind of world he was living in. After the war, he moves over to France, and he started to become very interested in philosophical ideas. Whilst he was in France, he attended a whole series of lectures given by great public intellectuals of the time. He attended lectures of great philosophers, but it was also here that he comes across the ideas of Jean-Paul Sartre. And as a result of his interests in philosophy, in psychology, he goes on to train as a psychiatrist in the city of Lyon. But of course, just because the war was over, and the fascism had been defeated, of course, racism still permeated every aspect of French society. You had colour bars operating at every single level of society, in housing, in bars, in entertainment, in employment, and what have you. Fanon had a white girlfriend. He got arrested because he was charged with trafficking in white women. That's how galling the racism was. He went on anti-colonial demonstrations that were taking place in France and was beaten up and arrested for being there. This was a world in post-war France where, although Fanon himself was interested in the ideas of psychology and philosophy, what passed as liberal philosophy and liberal psychology was really interested. There was a leading French psychoanalyst, Manoni, who said, talking about the native population, he said that the native population had willed colonialism in Madagascar by the French because they themselves suffered from a dependency complex. And Manoni was seen as being a liberal philosopher, a liberal psychologist. And so this was the kind of field, Fanon is interested in the ideas of psychiatry and psychology, but this is the kind of ideas that pass for liberalism at the time. He was so angry with this that it inspired him to write an essay called The Desalination of Blacks, and this was the great piece that would eventually come to form his masterpiece and his seminal work, Black Skin and White Masks, that was published in French in 1952. And this book combined both the interest that Fanon had and was developing, his deep engagement with questions of philosophy, but also questions of psychology and psychiatry, and also, of course, his own personal deep experience of racism, as well as the racism that he was seeing across the structures of French society. The book also begins to draw upon the ideas, I mentioned the influence of Jean-Paul Sartre, but also Fanon was deeply engaged with the ideas of Hegelian philosophy and also with the great revolutionary Karl Marx. And when the book, and those of you that have read it will probably see this, the book is also Fanon's riposte and his response to the racist colonial discourse of the likes of Manoni, who basically wanted to pathologize and talk about individual psychosis of colonized peoples. Because what Fanon is doing inside of that book is saying, no, actually, it's not to do with individual psychology. It's not to do with with any individual inadequacy of black people anywhere in the world. No, when we're talking about the root problems of racism, that are experienced in these societies. The root cause of this is the experience of colonial expansion and the imperial project itself, which has oppressed and exploited the indigenous peoples across the world. And this is very important because it also demonstrates the degree to which Fanon was wanting to pinpoint in material reality what the ailments were that were afflicting black people within the colonies, but also in terms of what the causes of mental illness were. He didn't just want to come out with a biological model which is going to pathologize black people. No, he was looking very concretely at the reality of the world that they lived in. And therefore he said that when we're talking about the Arab mentality is not something which is a given, it is something which is a direct response to the experience of French expansion and French colonialism. Now, because of his commitment to psychiatry, the book Black Skins and White Masks was originally written as his medical dissertation, and it gives you an indication how racist France was, because it was totally rejected on that basis, because it talked about the lived experience of the black person. But because he was so committed to psychiatry, Fanon eventually moves to Algeria, where he takes up a job at a local hospital. And here in September 1953, he becomes the head of the psychiatry department, and that's where he's to be for the next 3 years. Fanon begins to argue also in this book that the concept itself of blackness is not something which is a given. It is not a natural biological product, but this concept of blackness itself has been created by the very experience of racism that colonialism and slavery have given rise to. And therefore, this concept of blackness is itself rooted in the economics of capitalism and racism and slavery as we see it. And this was for this reason that he could turn around and write and say that there is no black mission, there is no white man's burden. He totally rejected all of these sorts of ideas as excuses for trying to pathologize black behavior. The book also discusses Fanon's attitudes and the ideas of negritude, which I'm not going to go into. If people wish to ask questions, then please do so. But the ideas of negritude were very much influenced to Fanon as a result of the teacher that he had in his native Martinique, Aimé Césaire, who sort of coined the term and began to use it. But nevertheless, for Fanon, what he took out of this sense of being proud and being black, his argument was that this was a phase that black people had to go to in terms of reclaiming their right to fight back and to resist racism and imperialism. Now, although the book goes through the psychology of how racism as a result of colonialism was impacting upon black people and demanded that black people should be looked upon as human beings, which of course they were not, and therefore he understood the importance of black people taking pride in their blackness and in their culture. Nevertheless, Fanon also argued that there was no point in harking back to some kind of fictitious past and thinking that that's where your salvation lay. Fanon was very much, his ideas as they were evolving were very much on the basis of the here and now and about the future in terms of how people are going to fight back. So when he writes about resistance to French colonialism in Vietnam in Black Skins and White Masks, he puts it like this. He says that the Vietnamese who die before the firing squads are not hoping that their sacrifice will bring about the reappearance of a past. No, he says, it is for the sake of the present and of the future that they are willing to die. So understanding that, yes, it's important to have a sense of pride in who and what you are, because that's something which you've been robbed of by colonialism and racism. But there's no point in dwelling upon that and thinking that you can return to something which will be, which may have existed or not existed. It's about what you're doing in the concrete reality of the here and now. Now, Algeria became very important to Fanon's life. His ideas are very much associated with the struggle for Algerian independence and also, obviously, the fight against colonialism. Algeria, of course, like Martinique, was part of the French Empire. It had been colonized and invaded by the French in the early 19th century. The country's population under French rule was totally decimated. It fell by 2 million in the next 20 years, in the early 19th century. It had quite a modernized education system. Literacy rates absolutely plummeted as this education was totally ripped asunder. Agricultural land inside of Algeria was totally turned over to European settlers and businesses to grow vineyards, etc. Now, I like wine as much as anybody else, but what it really demonstrates is how Algerian society was going to be turned over, like any colonial possession, to precisely the kind of cash crops that were going to return high dividends for the colonial project, and not at all designed for the native population in any shape or form. And therefore, Algerian society economically was deliberately held and developed into backwardness as a result of French expansion. By the 1930s, almost a century after French rule here, a nationalist movement begins to evolve inside of Algeria. The Second World War is also something which is very critical to this, because as a result of the war, we have an intensification of resistance inside of Algeria. There is also a sort of a nascent trade union movement that is evolving in Algeria at the time. And this, of course, the French react to this with total repression in terms of trying to hold the movement down. In 1945, in May, on the 8th of May, there was a turning point. There was a massive crackdown in a small town called Sétif. Over 20,000 Algerians were massacred by French authorities. And not just French authorities, but also European vigilantes, became mobs and went out on the rampage to attack any Algerian that dared to even look them in the eye, to basically teach them a lesson that you should know your place, you keep your head down, you do exactly what the white man tells you to do. Now this, thankfully, also began to harden attitudes inside of Algerian society. A year after Fanon had arrived in Algeria in 1954, a movement began to evolve, which became the National Liberation Struggle, a little-known group at the time that basically came to form itself, and this, of course, was the National Liberation Front, the FLN. That began the armed struggle for independence in Algeria. Fanon became a supporter of this very, very early on. He came into contact with FLN guerrilla fighters and began to become more fully involved in their struggle. The hospital that he was ahead of, he turned that secretly into wards that were going to treat the FLN fighters when they were injured, etc. It also provided psychiatric treatment because, of course, you are talking about war here. There were all sorts of issues of how people felt about experiences of torture and what have you. In this hospital, Fanon ensured that his staff treated not just those who were the indigenous population, those that had been tortured, but also the torturers themselves. Which is quite interesting. And it was also through this experience that he begins to start to firm up more his ideas about colonial violence and how colonial violence itself is beginning to shape the human psyche in terms of what is happening here. He also used his hospital as a transmission belt to supply all kinds of equipment to the FLN guerrilla fighters, and also therefore as a safe haven for those that were on the run. Now, by 1957, of course, he's a leading psychiatrist, the head of psychiatry in a leading hospital in Algeria. It becomes very obvious that this is what he is doing. He's receiving death threats left, right, and centre. He's certainly coming under the gaze of the colonial authorities and what have you, and therefore his activities, his job, his life is not safe. Algeria becomes very unsafe for him, and as a result of this, he takes a job. He leaves his job and decides that he's going to leave France, but he travels via Tunisia. He also begins to edit the FLN newspaper for a short period of time. And in his resignation letter, he said this in terms of describing the experience of colonial Algeria. He said, "If psychiatry is a medical technique which aspires to allow man to cease being alienated from his environment, I owe it to myself to assert that the Arab, who is permanently alienated from his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. The status of Algeria," he poses the question, his answer, systematic dehumanization. This is a real indictment on Algeria and French rule there. Now, as Fanon leaves Algeria, he also becomes and is appointed the ambassador for the FLN for the FLN. He goes to Ghana and he represents the FLN's provisional government. In Ghana. He also begins to visit the newly independent states, and obviously he's a champion of decolonization movements right the way across the African continent. He also argued for a time for an African legion that could challenge the leaders of independent African countries, because what he was also beginning to see at a very early stage was he was asking the question, well, what kind of post-colonial society are we going to have? And the ideas of Pan-Africanism also influenced him. And the reason he wanted an African Legion set up is because he really believed that this is going to be one way to put into practice what genuine Pan-African unity could be about, if you could actually have one African army marching right the way across the African continent, kicking out European powers left, right, and centre. Fanon writes another book in this period. It's a book that most people perhaps have not heard of. It's called A Dying Colonialism, which was published in 1959. It's quite a little-known book, but it's a fascinating book in itself. And it had a very deep impact upon the liberation movement. In this book, he writes about Algeria and the independence struggle there, and he writes particularly about Algerian women. And what he's pinpointing is how human relationships, particularly within the family, are undergoing enormous change and transformation as a result of being involved in a guerrilla warfare for independence. So he talks about how you have Arab women that sort of like going around in the streets, having to navigate their way through all kinds of French checkpoints, etc., dealing with the police and soldiers. And he writes about how, in that scenario, women have to make a choice about whether or not they're going to wear a veil or they're not going to veil. And this is something that they have to decide quite tactically, depending upon the circumstances. Those of you that have seen the great film Battle of Algiers, this is very, very graphically illustrated in that film. And it's very important, because also what this is going to the heart of is how Fanon is beginning to also understand questions of women's liberation and how these sorts of questions can come about, but also, of course, how this is again based upon concrete reality. So again in the book he talks about how fathers and other men are having to suddenly have to confront and make revisions in their attitudes towards their daughters, towards their wives, towards their sisters, because their daughters, their wives and their sisters are wanting to be involved as equal partners in the independence struggle. They're not just going to be happily sat at home knitting or anything like that. They're going to be equal partners in this. And it talks about how these ideas begin to be challenged inside of the family. But he also talks about how you have changes beginning to take place between the relationships between men and women as well, in terms of how attitudes towards women in very personalised relationships are also beginning to be challenged, because again the man cannot just take it for granted that little Missy is going to be at home keeping his slippers warm whilst he's out there fighting the great fight for independence. No, she's going to sod his slippers and go out and fight the good fight herself. It's a very good book, and I would recommend it to people. But of course, the other book that Fanon is most famous for, of course, is The Wretched of the Earth, which was published in 1961 after his death. And this has really become synonymous with the name of Fanon, particularly over the question of violence. And in many respects, I suppose, that's what many people, both defenders of Fanon, his admirers, as well as those who are detractors, pinpoint to is what his attitude was on the question of violence. Now, Fanon, sadly, was very ill whilst this book was being written. In fact, he didn't write it. He had to dictate it because he had been diagnosed with leukemia and therefore was very ill. But the book was written and obviously was published, thankfully for us. And the book is incredibly important because, again, it builds upon the ideas that he'd already put across in Black Skins, White Masks, and also about psychology and the psychology of racism, the psychology of empire, etc. But he also, in this book, starts to talk about the question of violence, obviously, but he also talks about the question of the peasantry within former colonial societies, and also how the relationship of what relationship this is going to have to the liberation struggle. And it also talks about, and this is also very important, his fears about what might happen after independence. I mean, today most of us are quite familiar, I suppose, with post-colonial theory, and I'll come back to that perhaps a little bit later on. But in this book, it has a wide-ranging attack upon colonialism, and it calls for an urgent necessity for people to come to arms to challenge colonialism. And in this, he wrote the following. He said, "When we revolt, it's not for a particular culture. We revolt simply because, for many reasons, we can no longer breathe." That's how he. That's where the quote, when I said began with, comes from. But the context in which Fanon meant it is also very familiar to us, because he said that the world that he lived in and the world that he saw was literally a world that was strangling, metaphorically, physically, materially, in every single possible way, the very lifeblood of the people that it was oppressing and exploiting. And it's in this context that his writings about violence have to be understood, because he saw violence as being a defining characteristic of the colonial project itself. He said, we live in a violent world, we live in a violent society, it is all around us. And therefore, for him, he argued and defended the right of the oppressed to use violence to defend themselves. He said that violence had to be used to resist colonialism. And in this, he was very, very similar to Lenin, because Lenin made a differentiation between the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed. And Fanon also is following in this vein of thought. But he went one step further, because he argued that in that armed struggle, if the armed struggle was really going to change individuals and individual consciousness, then violence was a tool, and obviously had been a tool of social control. Fanon argued that for the oppressed to use violence to resist colonialism, in that very process of using violence, it could act as, if you like, as a cathartic experience in terms of cleansing the decades, the centuries crap of what colonialism and racism had done to the colonized mind and the colonized body. And therefore, he regarded the question and the employment of violence as a necessary political tool of political engagement in opposition to the colonial project. So he writes the following. He said, "Violence is a cleansing force. It frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction." Now, this idea that there was some kind of redemptive quality to the use of violence would have a profound effect upon many activists looking to Fanon's ideas. I mentioned in my introduction the great Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the founders of the Black Panther Party. It had an incredible impact upon the Black Panther Party, because they took those words of Fanon and applied it inside their own organization. This is where their notion of, we're going to patrol the pigs, we're going to, if they pull a gun on us, we're going to pull a gun on the police, etc. Very, very, very important in terms of how it began to influence a whole series of resistance fighters throughout the 1960s and in the early 1970s. And this is tremendously important, because what all this new generation of fighters were saying is that we are not prepared to just turn the other cheek. If Gandhi is seen as being the apostle of peace, Fanon was somehow seen as being the apostle of violence. And in this particular context, for the oppressed, particularly in the way that the Panthers argued it, they had every right to use violence in order to defend themselves, and that in this it could act as some kind of cathartic movement. And for the Panthers, this was very important. People like Stokely Carmichael and Eldridge Cleaver, they were looking for some kind of tool, some kind of mechanism that could be in opposition to what they saw as being the pacifism of the civil rights movement and of Martin Luther King, which, although they admired King tremendously, they also felt that you could not just passively accept the violent force of the US state when they were lynching you, when they were firebombing you, when they were throwing hosepipes against you, etc., etc. So the ideas of Fanon, and particularly the ideas of the use of colonial violence and the justification for it, became very critical to the Panthers. But there was also another aspect of the wretched of the earth, which is quite important for Fanon. Now, Fanon obviously goes without saying, he was suspicious of colonialism, but he also became an early critic of post-colonial governments, because he saw very early on that these post-colonial governments and these liberation fighters, once they were coming to power, they actually were just replicating the existing societies. It was just literally you were having, black and brown skins replacing the white Europeans that had been governing those societies. And for Fanon, he looked at these new societies that were emerging, and he saw that they were totally characterized by corruption, by nepotism, by greed, but also by the uses of ethnic divisions, which of course had been fostered deliberately under colonial rule and then were being exacerbated by the independence movements themselves. He saw the economic dependency of Algeria as well as other colonies continue under independence. And he said that this all resulted from the mediocrity of the African elite that was emerging as the leadership class inside of these independent countries. And he noted how the great achievements of the revolutionary movements for independence were, if you like, being stolen from the very masses that colonialism was, the colonial liberation was supposed to free up. And his chief concern here was because what Fanon wanted was real economic freedom, was real social independence. And he talked about economic democracy and social democracy, and he said you cannot have this if all you're going to do is just replicate the existing system, but just with it being staffed by darker-skinned people. No, this was not going to result in independence in any shape or form. And he argued that he said that while people, and he put it like this, had given everything in the difficult moments of their struggle, after these struggles were over, he said they were left with their empty hands and bellies. They began to doubt the reality of victory. And C.L.R. James, great Trinidadian Marxist, put it brilliantly himself when he spoke about Fanon in November 1978, and he put it like this. He said, Fanon made one particular statement that I think ought to be remembered. He said that when a revolution is made in an undeveloped country, the people who make it are some intellectuals and other political leaders. But when the revolution is achieved, then for that people to achieve a new nation, the struggle has to be waged against those who made the revolution. In other words, understanding very clearly that the leaders of the national liberation movement, particularly because many of them were intellectuals, many of them were middle class, etc., that therefore they were materially removed from the realities of what it was like for most people who were on the receiving end of the worst impact of colonialism. So very, very important. And of course, this proved to be so prophetic in terms of what the reality of the post-colonial states have been like, whether it's been across Africa, whether it's been in India or in Vietnam or in China and elsewhere. And Algeria, of course, was no exception to this, because the FLN, the great guerrilla fighters that Fanon had helped, had nursed, had looked after, had provided for, etc., once they came to power, they became a complete and utter dictatorship and became every bit as ruthless as a French colonial state in terms of silencing dissent. So Fanon's focus, the reason why he focused so much on the question of violence in some ways, is because he saw that if the masses used violence, that it in itself perhaps could prevent this, if you like, deflecting of the colonial liberation movement in some form or another. That was not going to happen. Now, Fanon was right that any new society that was going to be emerged had to be shaped by the struggle against the colonial edifice. But if it was going to reflect the needs of ordinary people, it would also have to be something that they had to fight for actively themselves. And it's in this context that Fanon, although he'd been influenced by the ideas of Marx, his ideas were also influenced by all sorts of other notions. And these other notions were also impacted upon what he saw as being the real agent for change. So in the colonial situation, Fanon's views were also informed by the experience of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, by what was happening in Vietnam, and also by the Cuban Revolution. And in this context, he begins to emphasize the role of the peasantry as being a real revolutionary agent inside of these countries. And he wrote that in the colonial countries, it's the peasants who are alone are revolutionary, for they have nothing to lose and everything to gain. Very much a play upon Marxist analogy about the working class. He said that in the leading capitalist countries, such as France, such as Britain, Fanon agreed with Marx that, yes, in these societies, of course, it was the working class that could be the agent of change, because in those countries, the workers had nothing to lose but their chains. But he said that in the colonized world, it was different, because the workers he identified as being slightly parasitic. He said that workers in these former colonial countries had often been bought off by colonialism. They had slightly higher living standards, and it was the peasantry that was the more numerous, and therefore the peasantry had to be the agent of change. And this is what he regarded as being, if you like, the cadre. And in this sense, Fanon, if you like, is almost writing off, perhaps that's too strong, but by actually identifying the working class as having some kind of privileged status, what he's really suggesting is that somehow the working class, therefore, has bought into capitalism, and therefore the working class will never be able to fight back as an agent of change inside of society. And by valorizing the peasantry, this also led to another weakness, which, of course, was the weakness and the inability to differentiate the peasantry. It isn't the case that the peasantry is just one, homogeneous mass. In any particular society, there are the peasantry is divided itself into different layers of social class. For example, in India, which I work on, in India, in the colonial era and in the independence era, you had the rich peasantry, you had the middle caste peasantry, and then you had those at the very bottom of society, particularly those that were landless labourers, and the idea that somehow there was a commonality between these different sections of the peasantry it just doesn't exist in any shape or form. It never has done. And the same applied inside of colonial Algeria. And so therefore this is a fundamental weakness in terms of the prognosis and the solution that Fanon was posing here. But of course, the ideas of looking to the peasantry, again, had a major impact upon organisations that were inspired by Fanon. Again, coming back to the Black Panthers, they took this notion of, yes, the peasantry. If you like, sometimes in Marxist language, it's sometimes referred to, there's a term for it, the lumpen proletariat, which I know can sound quite offensive. But what it really meant, and this is what it meant in the context of the Black Panthers, is that what you focused on were the urban poor. It's what the Panthers called the brothers on the block. So these were young people, mostly men, of course, who were sporadically employed, sometimes people that were also in and out of prison, people that were involved in all kinds of criminal activity. And the Panthers took Fanon's ideas about the peasantry and the lumpen, as it were, and applied it in an urban setting, and with quite catastrophic results in terms of what happened to the Panthers. I mean, I haven't got time to go into it. I'm happy to answer questions about it afterwards. But this was never going to be a stable force with which to attempt to build any kind of resistance movement to US racism, let alone to international capitalism in any shape or form. And the Panthers, paid a very heavy price for an error in that. So it's a real shame that Fanon, therefore, was not able to see what the critical agent could be in terms of the importance of the working class. And this was even more regrettable, because when you think about the Algerian Revolution, I mean, Fanon dies, sadly, because of his leukemia. So he doesn't live to see Algeria achieve independence, but independence does come very shortly after his death. But in the independence struggle of Algeria itself, the struggle that Fanon had given so much of his life for, that independence could not have come about without the mass militancy of organised workers inside of Algerian society. There were mass strikes that took place in the civil war in Algeria. Without those mass strikes, without bringing the colonial regime to a halt, there is no way on earth the FLN would have been able to be victorious over the French colonial project. And so in this sense, obviously, you can't blame Fanon for not seeing that. He wasn't alive to see Algerian independence to come to full fruition. But because of the way that he understood what Algerian society was about in terms of examining the politics of colonial societies, but also because although he was influenced by Marxist ideas and liked the idea of revolution, he also was being influenced by the kinds of revolutionary waves that were taking place in other former colonial places, particularly in China, in Vietnam, and also in Africa as well. His notion of how this would come about, and therefore how it could be the peasantry as opposed to mass workers, was something that remained with him to his death. So, that's certainly something that, for me as a Marxist, I would point to as a weakness in terms of Fanon's ideas. But to sum up now, just in a minute or so, I mean, Fanon was absolutely brilliant as someone who was able to understand very, very quickly, both through his own direct personal experience as well as what he saw all around him, what the reality of both empire was about, what French imperialism meant, not just in his own native Martinique, but also, of course, in Algeria, and therefore was able to broaden his horizons in terms of understanding the impact of the colonial project, particularly on the way that it used racism and employed racism in terms of trying to make black people feel that they were inferior. And he rejected any notion of individual solutions or individual psychology and pointed to the very society that we lived in, that racism itself was a product of slavery and of capitalism and of the colonial project, and it was this that had to be resisted. It was also very important that he wasn't prepared to be a pacifist. It was very important. I mean, for me as a revolutionary, I don't want bloodlust. It's not like, yes, or give us all guns and we're going to go out there and, shoot Boris Johnson and God knows who else, however tempting that might be. What we want... I'm sure we can come up with lots of creative ways of torturing Boris Johnson and others without shooting him. But the whole point is that, that what I recognise, and Fanon recognised this, is that the world that we live in is a very violent world. It isn't that our side chooses to use violence. It is because violence is being thrown at us that therefore you have to defend yourselves by any means necessary. And that is something which is very, very important, fundamental to Fanon's ideas that we should take heart in, and it's incredibly important. But the other thing is also that in spite of whatever some weaknesses we might be able to identify in some of Fanon's ideas, he was a tremendous revolutionary. And that's why it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, it's tragic that it took a young teenage black boy who was being strangled to death by white police officers to utter his phrase, "I simply could not breathe." But I think, we have to take from that, yes, precisely, if we do not fight back and take up the fight that Fanon also fought for, then capitalism will simply not let us breathe. And in order for us to breathe, we have to continue the fight that Fanon started.